Welcome to the third video in this series covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, Conflict and Tension in Asia. This series of videos focuses on the Korean War. If you haven't watched the previous two videos on the origins of the Cold War and then the invasion of South Korea in June 1950, I would really recommend starting with those. And in today's session, we're going to be looking at the key question: how did the USA respond to the invasion of South Korea in 1950? Now, this video and all the other videos that I've created can be found on the hashtag HisTV YouTube channel, where lots of other history teachers have also recorded videos for their students. So in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at five key ways or five key events that took place in the US response to the invasion of South Korea in 1950. We're going to begin by having a look at the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. We're going to have a look at the meeting that they held just after the invasion of South Korea and the decision that was made to send troops to South Korea. We're going to examine the UN invasion force, the soldiers that were sent to support South Korea after they'd been invaded. We're going to have a look at the key events that took place when the UN forces actually then arrived in Korea and how they then advanced north through South Korea into North Korea, and then the danger that caused when China then joined the war. Let's begin by thinking a bit about the UN Security Council and what the United Nations actually is. So the United Nations was created after the end of World War II by the Allied nations of Britain, France, the USA and the USSR. The United Nations today has nearly 200 members and basically is an organisation that stands for world peace and good relations between its members. Now today there are 5 permanent nations: Britain, France, USA, the USSR and China, and they sit on what's called the United Nations Security Council. Now, the United Nations Security Council is the organisation within the UN that decides on whether or not the UN should send troops to a conflict and how conflicts should be resolved. Now, in addition to the 5 permanent members that are always on the United Nations Security Council, there are also 10 other non-permanent members, and they attend the meetings on a rota basis. And so any of the other countries, aside from the 5 permanent members, will sit on the United Nations Security Councils, usually for a period of 2 years, and they will take part in the decision-making process for the United Nations. Now, when the UN has a problem it needs to solve or is trying to resolve a conflict, they need 9 members to agree to be able to make a decision. And so if all 5 permanent members agree, and then at least 4 of the 10 non-permanent members agree, that decision is then made. The 5 permanent members, however, have a slightly more powerful vote. They have the ability to decline or veto any of the proposals that are made. So if, for example, a question was brought to the United Nations Security Council and one of the 5 permanent members said no, refused to act, or didn't want to agree with the other nations, they could do that. And this is called using the power of a veto. And that would mean that that decision has been vetoed. The United Nations Security Council cannot act. Now, we need to look at what was taking place after World War II, particularly after the Communist Revolution in China in 1949. In 1949, after China had become a communist nation, this question was posed to the UN Security Council: should communist China be allowed to join the United Nations? Now, of course, the USSR agreed. They were a communist superpower themselves, and having another communist nation on the United Nations Security Council would have been perfect for them. But we remember from our previous studies that the USA was capitalist. They were worried about the spread of communism and the rise of communist power across the world. And so the USA used their power of veto. Now at this point, the USSR got very angry and they walked out of the United Nations meetings. And they boycotted the UN because basically they wouldn't allow China to join. And so the USSR were not present. And that's a really, really important detail for explaining why the United Nations end up sending soldiers to South Korea. So let's think about the context of the time then. We know that North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, and President Harry S. Truman, the President of America, called an emergency UN Security Council meeting. And so at that meeting they meet to discuss what should happen in Korea. Now, days after the meeting, they meet and they discuss their response, and America, under Harry Truman, proposes that the UN should send an army to support South Korea and push the Korean People's Army out. Now, usually, the United Nations tries to avoid using force wherever possible. They would like to resolve conflict by peaceful methods wherever they can. Now, crucially, in this UN Security Council meeting, the USSR were not present. The USA has proposed that an army should be sent by the UN, and of course, if the USSR were there, they would be able to veto that decision. But because they were boycotting the meetings in protest of the decision to block China from joining, they were not able to do that. They were absent, they were unable to veto the USA's proposal. Now, the other members of the Security Council, without the USSR there, decided that North Korea had acted in an aggressive way. And so to begin with, they demanded that they leave South Korea. They didn't send troops straight away, they demanded that North Korean army would leave South Korea. But North Korea ignored the UN's demands, and so as a result, it was decided by the UN that military action was the only way to protect South Korea. Just pause the video for a moment, make sure you're really clear on United Nations, what the organisation stands for, what role the United Nations Security Council plays, and then the key events that led up to the United Nations deciding to send troops. Let's take a closer look then at the UN invasion force and some of the key details about the army that the United Nations sent. So, 2 days after the invasion of South Korea, the UN passed what we call a resolution that approves military action. And that's basically them signing a document that says, we think that sending an army is the best way to resolve this conflict. Now, the United Nations Security Council asked members to provide assistance to South Korea, and this was to repel the armed attack and restore international peace. And what that basically means is that the United Nations Security Council calls on members of the UN to send armed forces and to help South Korea repel the armed attack, which means to get rid of the North, and then to restore international peace. Now, soldiers were sent to Korea from 16 different United Nations countries. But really in this conflict, the United Nations is made up mainly of American forces. Over 50% of the United Nations forces were from the USA, 86% of the naval forces, so ships and sailors, were also American, and 93% of the Air Force was American too. An American general, General Douglas MacArthur, was put in charge of the United Nations soldiers, and he was given the title Commander-in-Chief. So if we just think about this for a moment, this really is a battle between communism and capitalism. But of course, if America was to declare war, that would then be an act of war, the USSR would then join, and then we'd be in World War III. So America here really is fighting through the United Nations. America is represented on the United Nations, but as we can see, a huge number of the soldiers that went, more than any other nation, were from America. Now let's think about the leader of the UN forces, the Commander-in-Chief, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was hugely experienced. He had served for the USA in World War I and in World War II, and then after the Japanese surrender in 1945, he was put in charge of Japan. Now he was very strong-willed. He had a particularly aggressive and arrogant and stubborn leadership style, and that meant that he often argued with politicians because of that. And we're going to see that really come back to haunt him and to haunt America later on in this video. So the United Nations agreed to send soldiers from 16 different countries to support South Korea. Let's think about the key events that took place then when these forces arrived in South Korea itself. If we think about the priorities they had, well, by September 1950, the South Korean army had been pushed into a very small area around the city of Busan in the southeast of South Korea. And so MacArthur's priorities as the leader of the United Nations Army was to help the South Korean army in Busan, to take back the capital city of Seoul, and also then to drive North Korea back beyond the 38th parallel and out of the south. So there are two attacks that took place simultaneously. On the 15th of September 1950, United Nations forces launched a surprise attack at a place called Incheon on the west coast of South Korea. And you can see that represented with the left-hand arrow in the icon. UN forces then travel 40 kilometers inland, and they also recapture the South Korean capital of Seoul. At the same time, UN forces also land at Busan in the southeast of the country and also launch an attack. And what we see here then is a period where the UN forces are pushing the North Korean army back towards the border and the 38th parallel. By early October, the North Korean People's Army had been pushed back beyond the 38th parallel and out of South Korea. And so the United Nations aims to save South Korea from a communist takeover had been achieved. They had achieved the aim of stopping South Korea from becoming communist, of pushing the North Korean army back across the 38th parallel, South Korea had been saved from a communist takeover. And you might be thinking at this point, well, why wasn't that the end of the war? And we'll come to that in just a minute, because of course the United Nations had achieved their aims. Let's just have a look at the map of Korea. We keep revisiting this throughout these videos, just to think about the chain of events. So remember, in September 1950, there were simultaneous attacks at Incheon, which is a port on the west coast, and then at Busan in the southeast. The United Nations Army then pushed up through South Korea, reclaimed the capital city of Seoul, and then pushed the North Korean army back across the 38th parallel. Now it's at this point that the greed and the leadership style of MacArthur really starts to unravel and to make life difficult for the Americans. Let's have a look at the UN forces advancing north then. So after successfully pushing North Korean forces out of South Korea, the United Nations, led by MacArthur, saw an opportunity to reunify or to bring North and South Korea back together again. And this really is being greedy, essentially. This is an opportunity to get one over on the communists. And so in October 1950, MacArthur's UN troops advance north. They go beyond the 38th parallel and they then move into North Korea. At this point, China, who we know of course are an ally of North Korea, their leader Mao Zedong warned that China would join the war and support North Korea if the UN did not stop advancing north, that's supposed to say. Now, President Truman, President of America, really wanted to avoid escalating the conflict. But he was persuaded by MacArthur that China were just bluffing. They were just making threats. They weren't really serious about joining the war. And so the United Nations troops continue to advance further and further north until they get to the Yalu River. MacArthur ignores Mao Zedong's warnings. They push north right up to the North Korean border with China, back towards the Yalu River. At that point, though, it becomes very apparent that China were not bluffing. They were not making empty threats. And so they react and respond with huge force. Let's take a look at that. So MacArthur's promise to Truman that China would not join the war was proved to be completely wrong. In late October 1950, over 200,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River in support of the North Korean army, and they're armed with weapons, tanks and planes from the USSR, incredibly well equipped and ready for a fight. Now at this point, MacArthur and President Truman clash. Truman was worried that conflict with China could lead to a bigger war with the USSR, and he was satisfied that America and the UN had done their job. They had protected South Korea. But MacArthur, on the other hand, wanted to unite Korea. He saw an opportunity for glory. He demanded that the Chinese should surrender, and he also threatened to use nuclear weapons to defeat China. And it was at this point that Truman had enough. President Truman was absolutely furious with MacArthur and sacked him as the commander-in-chief of the UN troops. MacArthur was brought home, but that was really unpopular in America because he was seen as a war hero. But Truman, on the other hand, argued that he was trying to limit the scale of the war. He was trying to stop America ending up in a war with the USSR and China. Remember that America and the USSR both possess nuclear weapons. He was trying to avoid mutually assured destruction. He was trying to stop war from spreading too much. So there we have it. And again, if we look at the map of what took place, okay, the United Nations forces cross the 38th parallel, okay, and they push all the way up to the Yalu River. But by October 1950, China and 200,000 Chinese soldiers then cross back across the Yalu River and start to push the UN army back south. In the next video, we'll talk about the impact of China joining the war and what that had on the fighting, and how it then very quickly ended up at a stalemate around the 38th parallel. But we'll save that for next time. So there we have it. Today we've looked at the United Nations Security Council and their role in deciding to send forces to South Korea. We've looked at the invasion of South Korea by the UN forces and how they pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. We've looked at General MacArthur's leadership and how under his decision-making, UN forces advanced all the way to the north. And then we've looked at how China, after MacArthur ignored the threats of Mao Zedong, China then joined the war and responded. Thanks for listening. Hope it's been useful.